This parallel, this great parallel between ancient Judaism, i.e. what we also call Mosaism, i.e. the religion carried by Moses, and Islam. So the first thing we have to do in order to accept this parallel intellectually is to distinguish between ancient Judaism as it was and Judaism as it is today, i.e. to understand that it's not the same thing. When we talk about Judaism, we're talking about today's religion, which is ethnic, based on identity, concerns a small minority, is withdrawn, relatively closed, not easy to get into. Few people want to get into it, not for the elite, etc. So we need to start by getting rid of our old ways of thinking. So we have to start by getting rid of this misconception. Before I explain how, I'd like to remind you that you can send any questions you'd like to ask me via the chat to Guillaume, who will pass them on to me. If these questions are directly related to the talk I'm giving, he'll pass them on to me straight away, and if not, they'll be relayed in the big question time at the end of the show, and we'll deal with them all, of course. No issues this time. So, ancient Judaism, first of all, to come back to this question, in fact, ancient Judaism, to take a mirror effect, is the Islam of antiquity. In other words, it was a very proselytizing religion. A long time ago, I wrote an article on my blog, which you can find again, Ancient Judaism Proselytized, in which I explain, well, we find texts that are still present in the Talmud, for example. There's a formula. Israel was only exiled so that it could grow through proselytes. You have the Christian sources too. You have Matthew's Gospel, in which Christ exclaims, "Woe to you scribes and hypocritical Pharisees, who travel the seas to gain in proselytes, and when you have gained them, you will make them worthy of embarrassment," etc. So there was indeed talk of a religion that was proselytizing. Incidentally, it's a quote from Bernard Lazare in his book L'Histoire de l'Antisémitisme, which you can find. It's quite old. It dates from the first quarter of the 20th century, or maybe the 1930s. You can find it on Wikisource, in which he quotes a work by Philo of Alexandria, in which he is said to have said. So it's a quote that may have been reconstructed by Bernard Lazare himself. I haven't found it in the places he says. I haven't found it in Flavius Joseph. But hey, I think the idea is quite right, because it's quite close to other quotes by Philo and other places where he said, "Our customs win over and convert to them the barbarians and Hellenes, therefore the Greeks, the continent and the islands, east and west, Europe and Asia, the whole earth from one end to the other. The customs of this detestable nation have spread with such force that they are received by all nations. The conquered have made law for the conquerors." So there were many conversions to Judaism in different modes. There were conversions in a warlike mode, notably the conversion of the Idumeans, who were neighbors of Judea in the 1st and 2nd centuries BC. And then you have other conversions, which were either rich Jews converting their slaves, or many. In the Hellenistic period, you know, the Greeks and Romans went looking for religions in the East, which were a little exotic and successful in those societies precisely because they were exotic. In the same way, since the second half of the 20th century, Buddhism and other Eastern religions have been on the rise. When it comes to spirituality, we often look for the exotic because we tell ourselves that the answers lie outside, not within. Those who are looking for answers they haven't found in their original culture rarely, if ever, immerse themselves in their local culture. By the way, let me remind you of something I didn't say at the beginning. I mentioned Civilization C, which refers to both Islam and Judaism in my model, and I'll come back to this when I speak again, particularly when we talk about the United States next time. There are 4 main civilization models. Civilization A, which is of the European or Greek type. Civilization B, which is Rome or America. Civilization C, which is Islam or Judaism. And what I call Civilizations D, these are the civilizations of continental empires, like the Persian Empire, the Mongol Empire, these things. They always play more or less the same role, and these 4 major groups of civilizations form a kind of system that goes through cycles lasting around 1,600 years. So the ancient cycle is the appearance of Greek civilization around 1,100 BC. This is really the beginning. It's the Greek Middle Age up to the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century. And the current cycle is from the fall of the Roman Empire to the present day, and probably another century or two. So that's where these names come from, actually. And this is important because we're going to see that Islam, in its relationship with Europeans and Americans, is in the same kind of relationship as ancient Judaism was with the Romans and Greeks. And here, with this rather hostile quotation from Seneca, you have an example of what the Judeophobia of the Romans was, which echoes to some extent today's Islamophobia. The last element that shows you that Judaism was very proselytizing is if you look at the demographics. If you look at the demographics in the 8th century BC, historians, particularly Israel and Finkelstein, count that the kingdoms of Israel and Judah numbered around 160,000 people. The ancient population is not really voted in the same way as today, you have to realize. So 160,000 people in the 8th century BC, whereas historians' estimates for the 1st century AD, i.e. the 1st century of the Roman Empire, put the Jewish population in the empire at around 4.5 million. So in 7 centuries we would have gone from 160,000 to 4.5 million. If this were a natural rate of growth, it would be far greater than that experienced by the whole world, if you like, since the advent of modern medicine with the demographic explosion, the demographic transition, etc. So of course this couldn't have happened in ancient times. We have a question in connection with Jewish proselytism, which says, don't you think that proselytizing Judaism was part of the development of their culture, whereas today proselytizing Islam is associated with the last breath? Well, I'm going to come to that, because in fact it's part of the evolution. It comes in waves, because it's a culture, and you're going to see what I call political monotheism too. In other words, there are several phases of proselytism like that. I'll get to that. Don't worry, at the time it represented around 7% of the population of the Roman Empire, which was quite considerable, and that's what gave this is one of the things we're talking about. It's not the heart of his thesis, because he goes on to talk mainly about what happened in the 19th century and compares the phenomenon of modern Jewish identity to that of the rise of nationalism in Europe and of national identity. That was Shlomo Sanz's book, How the Jewish People was Invented. But if you like, he talked a little bit about that, about the origins, let's say, of multi-ethnic Judaism, and in particular about the important phenomenon of conversion in the Roman Empire. And it's important because, if you like, it takes you away from the modern vision of Judaism, which is something very closed, very identity-based, very ethnic, and which doesn't seek to expand. And this ancient Judaism, which in the end was close to what Islam is today, is basically a religion with a basic ethnic identity, as was the case with Judaism, since Judaism comes from the Hebrew. The Arabs, if you like, are the Hebrews of Islam. In other words, they're the basic people, the ones whose culture gave rise to the religion. But then you have a whole host of peoples who are conquered. You have North Africans who were Berbers. You have populations from Pakistan today, Indonesians, Chechens. You have all the continents that are affected by this. So you have to understand that Judaism in antiquity was the same. On the Mediterranean rim, I've got some maps to illustrate this, Guillaume, if you could post them for us. This doesn't mean that the density is the same everywhere where it's yellow, but let's just say that in orange, each time you have the starting point of the culture, of the religion. So Palestine for Judaism and the Arab world, what we call the Arab world for Islam, which is also the place of the first Arab conquest, in the same way that Palestine, we'll come back to, is the place of the first Hebrew conquest. Then in yellow you have all the missionary expansion of these religions, which spread out a little bit everywhere and had significant communities that developed. It's not the same everywhere, of course. When you look at the yellow in Africa, it's naturally a density that's not at all the same as when you put a little yellow in South America or North America or even in Europe, but it's not the same as in Turkey, for example. But if you like, this is to show you that in both cases we have an expansion that affects almost the entire known world, what we might call the known world at the time. And as far as Spain is concerned, it must have been in the orange zone because the occupation lasted, if I'm not being silly, about 6 years. So that's a good question. Let's just say that I didn't put it in there because, yes, they did stay for 700 years, but it didn't remain a Muslim land. On the other hand, if you like, it's really the Arab world, i.e. what has remained the Arab world, what has remained Muslim since the conquest in the 7th century. Since the 7th, 8th century, that hasn't changed. These are regions that have remained mostly Muslim, that have remained marked by Arab culture. You're right to point that out. So that's it for this first point, to understand that this parallel shouldn't be rejected a priori simply because Judaism has evolved. And Judaism has evolved precisely because the Judaism you have today is the product of the last phase of the end of the forced lowering of this religion and culture. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how this happened and what characterizes the parallel trajectory of Islam and Judaism. I'm going to draw on what I had done, on what I had put in my atlas, in my history of the century to come. Quite simply, I had listed, so it's debatable on the detail, but let's say it's 9 major stages in the evolution of these civilizations. The first is that a sea civilization is born in a nomadic community. So you have a prophet who is a character who flees his place of origin and who gives his nomadic people a politico-religious law which recovers an older tradition, and thus leads this population in the appropriation of a territory. This is the case with the Exodus and the Hebrews behind Moses who conquered Canaan, and it's the case with Egypt, Muhammad, who first fled Mecca, then seized Mecca, and who began with his heirs in particular, who conquered the rest, who will leave the Arabian Peninsula in the same way that Moses did not enter Canaan. He had been condemned by God not to do so, and it was Joshua who led the Hebrews into Canaan. So I know it's a fashionable question and some people are even starting to question it. Generally speaking, it's people who dispute the veracity of the Muslim religion, so they go all the way and dispute the reality of Muhammad's existence. So I'm on the same line with both of them, i.e. I think it's difficult to establish the totality of the historical facts about them. I think that, by and large, those who tell the story read their own history, and as far as Moses is concerned, which isn't a cut and paste of the Gilgamesh epic recovered from the Persians, I see no reason to dispute its historical veracity, especially as once again we find the same thing in both of them, and that's what's interesting. Because in fact these religions, these political monotheisms, have the particularity of appearing in a world that is in total collapse, as part of a systemic collapse. So in the case of Islam, it appeared on the bangs of a collapsing world order. So Islam appeared among the Arabs of Mecca, who were on the bangs of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantines and the Persian Empire, the Sassanid Empire, who fought a terrible war against each other in the 6th century, really terrible, which was very long, which ruined them both, and which led to their collapse in the same way as the Western Roman Empire, Persia and the Egyptian bloc, the crescent between Egypt and Greece, were really the old cultural and civilizational zone of antiquity. These were countries that had practically always been rich, or at least they were the countries that had developed first and remained very rich for a very long time. So Islam appeared there in that region, and Judaism, or at any rate the distant origins of Judaism, which are debated. You've got a whole bunch of discussions. You've got Thomas Romer's lectures at the Collège de France, which are very interesting on this subject. I always agree with what he says. He's much more of a specialist in this than I am, but there are points on which, the points most open to interpretation, and on which we have the least facts. I generally have disagreements, particularly on the existence of Moses and the historicity of Abraham too, but that's more ancient. And if you like, the escape of the Hebrews from Egypt, as we usually try to date it, is in relation to David and Solomon. We know roughly when that would be. It would be around 1000 BC, in fact. Very simple. And so when we follow the generations of the narrative in the book of Numbers and Exodus, we come up with the idea that Moses would be around the 12th century BC. It's that way. The 12th century BC was the time of the systemic collapse of pre-ancient civilization, i.e. the Mycenaean Empire, the Egyptian empires, the Hittite Empire, all of which collapsed at the same time in the 12th century BC. So it's a real collapse. It's the barbarian escapes in Greece. It's the arrival of the Dorians, what they call the return of the Heraclides, which I'll talk about again in another video when we discuss Greece and Europe in parallel. And so in these situations you have a global collapse of reference points, and so you have the old religions losing much of their credibility, and so this creates a kind of spiritual and mystical effervescence that excites the religious imagination a little. And since you no longer have any points of reference, and we're looking for points of reference, so it's like an open market in which there's no dominant position. Throughout history, there have always been people who hold mystical beliefs and feel enlightened, believing that they are receiving messages from God. But in these periods, these are people who find it much easier to find an audience because people are in demand of that, in search of that. They've lost their bearings, so they pay attention. These are times when astrologers are listened to much more, and so on. And in general, they all revolve around more or less the same ideas because they're in a kind of primitive intellectual, spiritual, or religious soup, which is a legacy of what came before, mixed with ideas that are in vogue at the time. So it gets mixed up, and you have a whole bunch of people who are a bit like that, mystics who appear and who pretty much all have similar ideas. And this was probably the case in Moses' time. We know that there were other prophetic figures of the same kind who said more or less the same things, but who didn't have the same success. So what makes one of them emerge? Natural selection. That is to say, people often fight amongst themselves. They manage to conquer followers. Then that makes bands. And then they fight, and it's the one who starts winning who, by accumulating success, accumulates proof of his divine election. In fact, the Battle of Bedere, which he took from a caravan, marks the beginning of Muhammad's ascent and begins to establish his authority, followed by other victories. So the more victories he has, the more he seems to be elected, and so it carries him along in a kind of dynamic. Presumably the same thing happened to Moses, since you have the episode of the battle against the Amalekites during the desert crossing. So it's the one where Joshua and Aaron support. Is Joshua the other one? Or Joshua leading the battle? I don't know. I know that Aaron is one of the two who support Moses' arms, i.e. he helps him pray, and as long as he supports his arms praying, so the Hebrews win, and when he gives up he tires, so he stops praying, so the Hebrews, well, and they win. And it's a bit of the same thing, and so it's that which consecrates a little, which allows the Hebrews not to be scattered in the desert, but to continue their famine. So that's how history is written, so you have natural selection through military success. But it's a kind of determinism because you're bound to have one who stands out from the crowd. And he's bound to have the same ideas as if it had been someone else. And so these ideas are the basic ones in Judaism and the basic ones in Islam, i.e. a religion that is very summary in its precepts, very focused on very material things, with dietary prohibitions, with social obligations, because as it appears in a real situation of social, political, etc. decay, inevitably one expects a message that responds to things like that. And we'll see that it's not the same in Christianity, because Christianity appears in a totally different light. Christianity appeared under the flourishing Roman Empire, so it's not at all the same worries as Christianity. But in Islam and Judaism, it's the same thing, because they appear in those circumstances, and so they're steeped in that moment. This dynamic leads to the conquest of land, since it's usually gangs of plunderers who adapt this religion, and so they set out to conquer lands that are naturally more fertile. So this is how the Arabs came out of Arabia, and how the Hebrews came out of the desert, i.e. from Sinai probably, where they were Bedouin caravans who seized Canaan and perpetrated massacres, since this is what's recounted in the Book of the Normans. Book of the Normans. Once they've arrived in these lands, this is Antarise, in the same way that the Franks became masters of the Roman populations of northern France. If you're Arabs arriving in the east in the 8th century, you become masters of the local population. That's how it happens, and as you impose a tax on the subjugated populations, they have an interest in converting, and then what's more, they have an interest in joining the victor, quite simply. This often happens, and it doesn't just happen in these religious situations. You have totally non-religious situations where you have parts of the defeated population who have mingled with a victorious horde. It happened during the Mongol invasions, for example, and it happened Attila's Huns. There was a little bit of everything in there. You had Avars, things like that, Alans, that they had picked up a little bit on the way, and who joined the victors without there being any religious elements in there. But now we're in a situation where there is a religious element, so that's how it's created. it temporarily leads to a golden age because you have an empire that is created with a very strong political unity. So it's the vast period of the King Solomon and David. It's the first caliphs, and then you have the local divisions that reemerge. Once things start to calm down, you have local interests reappearing and putting tensions back on this empire that's been created. So you have the division between the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, Israel to the north, Judah to the south, and you have the political division of the Ummah that intervenes with the religious schisms between Sunnism and Shiism. You have the political schisms, it's between the Umayyads, the Abbasids, and so on. You also have schisms like that in the Jewish religion. The Samaritans, for example, were in a schismatic situation in relation to Judaism, which remained attached to the temple. It's exactly the same kind of mechanism. So you have this civilization which then enters a phase of decline, particularly because it clings so much to its religious dogmas and precepts, and then finds itself dominated by a foreign power, which is generally what I've been calling a civilization of dice. So for the Jews, it was the Achaemenid Persians who arrived and deported the Jews to Babylon. First it was the Babylonian Assyrians, then the Achaemenids, and for the Muslim world it was the Turks, from another ethnic group as well from the east. Each time they took over a part of the religious world, but not all of it. The Persians took Israel, but not Judas, and the Seljuk Turks reached Egypt, but not beyond. At first, they didn't continue into the Mediterranean. Then, in a second phase, they ended up being completely dominated. That's how the late Achaemenid Persian Empire got as far as Egypt. So it dominated the entire Jewish world. And the Ottoman Empire dominated almost the entire Muslim world as far as the Maghreb, Morocco having always remained outside Ottoman domination. Next phase, Civilization D always ends up being broken by Civilization A. So the Persians by the Greeks and the Ottomans, the Turks by the Europeans, and then Civilization A replaces Civilization D in the domination of the latter, of C. So it was the Greeks who began to dominate the Jewish lands and the Europeans who began to dominate most of the Muslim world at the time of colonization. And so there's a moment like that of occupation that lasts, and then we switch to a phenomenon of nationalist uprising. In other words, within the lands of sea civilization, peoples rise up and seek to re-establish at least one sovereign state based on their own culture and not subject to a foreign power. This is how you get the Maccabean revolt in the 12th century BC, which established what is known as the Asmonean state. It's a dynasty. It's the Asmoneans who run the state at that time. And then it's marked by imitation, if you like. At that point, the state that is set up is marked by an imitation of the mores and institutions of the former dominant, i.e. Civilization A. This is how the Asmonean state is structured, like a Hellenistic state, like the kingdoms of Alexander's ancient empire. And so power was not very religious, it was very secularized. And you have the same thing with Pan-Arabism and Arab socialism, which acted to decolonize the Muslim world, but put in place powers that were not based on the Muslim religion, and which tried to rely on an imitation while being in opposition to an imitation of what had been imported from the West. And so we enter the last phase. The last phase is the arrival of Civilization B, i.e. Rome on one side, the Americans on the other, who put their finger in the spiral because little by little A is weakening and so B is rising, as we'll no doubt see in other programs. So you have a situation of a new occupier with the birth of a progressive feeling of hostility to that power, which will then lead to a whole series of extremely deadly wars pitting the populations of C against that power, between the populations of C and what I would call the culture of the couple AB, because civilizations A and B are always culturally close, the Greco-Romans, the Europeans, and the Americans, i.e. the West, and what we call the civilization, what Toynbee globally called the Hellenic civilization, i.e. the Romans, were practically integrated to it. The result was a great war, what we might call a clash of civilizations between the cultural and religious identity of C and the culture of couple AB, manifested in a strong return to religion, a new proselytism, and an often fanatical revival of religion. So that's what I had put a little bit on the beautiful vignette you did, Guillaume, for the show. On one side you had a representation of the Jews of Masada. They were elotes, i.e. fanatical warriors, and that the Jewish general who rallied to the Romans, a sort of General Sisi in Egypt for example, was therefore hostile to the Jewish religious fanatics who said that they were revolutionaries, i.e. people who brought a new doctrine that went beyond what had been said before. They weren't just ultra-conservative. And we can put them in parallel with Daesh because they committed the same kind of exactions when they succeeded in seizing Jerusalem. They committed exactions against, we often hear you say that Muslims are the first victims of Islamist terrorism, but somewhere back then, Jews were the first victims of Jewish terrorism. So it's this last great phase which is paroxysmal and leads to great wars, which are the great Judeo-Roman wars, and which lead to absolutely terrible confrontations, and in particular to eschatological concerns, i.e. the end of time. They're fanatic, they think, and today's Muslims rely on a tradition that already existed among the Jews in the texts of Ezekiel, on the prophecies of the end of the world, the war against Gog and Magog, i.e. all the infidel nations. The idea that at the last moment, when the faithful people are about to lose the war, God will send a military leader, the Messiah, among the Jews, who was supposed to be a military leader, which is why they decided on Jesus, and the Mahdi among Muslims. It's exactly the same movement. I have a theory, in fact a conjecture, because it's impossible to disprove, impossible to prove, but it's my opinion and I share it, about the burning of Rome, the famous burning of Rome at the time of Nero in the year of Jesus Christ, which, if you remember correctly, there was a persecution launched against Christians. So it's important to know that the history of persecutions against Christians, we're going back over it a little historically, because not everything can be attributed to the Christian followers of Christ. And even under Nero, that's not what it meant. When I think it was Seneca who said that a certain Chrestus had caused trouble in Rome around 40 AD, and that this was what had motivated Emperor Claudius to expel the Jews from Rome, it's obvious that he wasn't a disciple of Christ. Maybe it wasn't 10 years after Jesus' death that you already had a large enough community to make a mess of things in Rome. So quite simply, you need to know that Christ, in fact, as those with a religious education know, Christ means in Greek what Messiah means in Hebrew, i.e. that is far from the Lord, the chosen one, quite simply. And so whenever the Jews gave themselves thought they were recognizing as Messiah a local military leader who was the leader of the rebels, in fact, quite simply, they were saying, that's it, it's him. In the same way as today, whenever you have an Islamist revolt somewhere, people often designate their leader as Al-Mahdi. That was the case with the Mahdists of Sudan at the end of the 19th century. That was the case so Muqtada al-Sadr in Iraq wasn't considered Tuesday, but his troops called themselves the Tuesday Army. The same thing, there you go. So if you like, back then, whenever there was a leader like that, he'd say he was the Messiah, and so in Greek the Christ, right? And so the fact that my interpretation is that when the Romans thought that in fact this burning of Rome, which we're not even sure is criminal today, so I tell you, it's my theory, I think it was. Why do you think so? Because it echoes so well with modernity. I think the fire in Rome was a terrorist fire of Messianic Jews, In other words, it was a bit like the 11th of September in Rome. And that fits in with what was going on, because you had therefore the Zealots and the Caesareans in particular, who were people armed with daggers because they carried out knife attacks. So there's also something to do with current events. Massacred Greek citizens in particular in the East, throughout the dynastic world, in particular where the Greeks were most in contact with Jewish populations, i.e. the Near East and Egypt, in Alexandria in particular. And so they sometimes attacked public buildings, they attacked temples, pagan temples. So we were into exactly the same sort of thing that Islamists do today on occasion. And so the wars were truly terrible on an almost genocidal scale for the Jews of antiquity. So it's hard to put a figure on it, but we think it must have reached 1 or 2 million deaths, over the whole of the wars, which stretched over a little more than 60 years. The first Judeo-Roman war began in 66, and the last, the revolt of Bar Korba in Jerusalem in 135. This is the one that ends with the expulsion of the Jews from Palestine. The destruction of the temple took place in 72 in 73 after the fall of after the defeat in the Judeo-Roman War. And it was at the end of this first war, if you like, that what is known as Arabitic Judaism began to emerge, i.e. the Judaism of today. In other words, the temple was destroyed, the priests were evacuated, and it was the rabbis, therefore, who weren't the ones who didn't have the central role, if you like, at the base, who had a role that was a little like that of the ulama today in Islam, i.e. they were more interested in the law than in worship. And it was they who actually produced the Talmud, etc. In other words, an attempt at synthesis, because Arab Judaism was a kind of abandonment in the end of the Messianic idea, because they were so badly beaten, so massacred, following so many Messianic uprisings, where each time they said, here's the Messiah, that in the end, well, they practically stopped. They said to themselves, well, we'll stop waiting for the Messiah on every street corner. He's obviously not going to arrive. At least he's not going to arrive like that. He's not going to arrive now. Is he ever going to come? It's a kind of doubt that's taken root, and that's what gave rise to modern Judaism. It's from this Arab Judaism that it's heir. And the great catastrophe at the end of the history of Judaism, not the best known war, but the one that took place in 17th, was the Kitos War, named after the Roman general Catus, who carried out the repression. In fact, Trajan had set out to conquer the empire of the Parthe Empire, which was the Persian Empire at the time, and he and the Jewish communities who were getting along well in the Parthe Empire, who had no difficulties, were badly treated by the Romans, and this provoked an uprising of Jews in the whole of the eastern Mediterranean, from like Syria, Egypt, and so on. And the Alexandria community was practically massacred by the Roman army. And so that was the end, in fact, of this history of ancient Judaism and its expanding movement. And today we're in much the same situation.